A lot of people new to woodworking have the same question. I'm on a budget, I can only buy one saw blade for my table saw, what do I buy? For me, it's the Diablo 40-tooth general purpose blade, hands down, no questions asked. When you're in a situation of only having one blade, we are making a compromise. We're not going to get as good of rips as with a rip blade, and we're not going to get as good of crosscuts as with a crosscut blade. It's a simple fact. This one blade is not going to be able to be better than both of those at their specific task. This blade runs about $28 to $30, $35 depending upon when and where you buy it. They're very commonly available either at Home Depot. I don't know about Lowe's. I haven't been to a Lowe's in a long time, but online you can find them anywhere. And it's usually pretty consistent in price. These don't seem to go up a ton over time. And that's what I really like about it. It's easy to find, it's relatively cheap, and it just works pretty well at what you need it to do. The other main competitor in this debate is the 50-tooth combination blade. And there are two main differences here. One, more teeth, where we also have 1 in 5 of each section of teeth is a flat top grind, meaning the top of the tooth is flat, unlike the others that are alternating bevel teeth. And then of course, the more teeth in theory should leave a cleaner crosscut. That's generally the idea. Going higher and higher into the teeth, you get more cuts per rotation. They're cleaner, each of them. It works okay at these, but I don't find that it's really any better to an extent where I'm not okay with just using the 40 tooth. I think the 40 tooth rips significantly better and is closer to the rip blade and close enough to the crosscut blade, whereas this is pretty slow and occasionally you get some burning at ripping, and it's not good enough at cross-cutting to make me accept that compromise. I just don't find that these rip anywhere near as well, and the crosscuts just aren't amazing, and it's certainly not enough to pay the extra money as well. Now, the one argument in favor of the 50 tooth is that due to that flat top grind tooth for every 4 alternating bevel teeth, you'll in theory get a cleaner bottom. If you're doing a non-through cut, dado, groove, spline, some kind of box joint joinery on the table saw, but in my opinion, it still leaves a little bit of that kind of fang look. The alternating bevel teeth, they definitely leave that kind of fanged, pointy top. And in theory, this should clear out most of it. It clears out a lot of it, but it's still enough there that there is a gap. It is not a flat top grind rip blade. If you are severely concerned about getting the flat bottoms, you need a flat top grind blade or a dado blade if you're cutting thicker grooves and you want to just take it all out in one. Now, there are a lot of people out there who go solely with the rip blade. And the main argument for that is that if you are a hand plane person with a shooting board, you can clean those crosscuts up. Now, I think you get a lot of tear out on these, especially if it's a certain type of wood that's tear out prone, so you got to take a lot of precautions. But you're going to get some tear out with the 40 tooth as well. In fact, almost all blades except those 80, 90 super high tooth count blades are going to get some tear out. So you can absolutely go pure ripping blade, flat top grind if you're willing to deal with cleaning up the crosscuts, or if you don't need clean crosscuts for some reason. If you're just screwing everything together and you're not looking for any glue on glue or wood on wood glue surface joinery, then I guess it doesn't matter. If you're just doing construction projects, maybe that's fine for you. I don't want to spend my time having to go from rip blade to dealing with tear out to then dealing with shooting the end of the crosscut and cleaning it up. That's just my personal preference, but these do rip wood significantly faster, especially the thicker it gets. There's no debate about that. These are very good at what they're intended to do, just like the crosscuts are very good at what they're intended to do. They leave much cleaner surfaces than either of these compromised blades. We're going to quickly look at 4 different things here: the quality of the rip, the quality of the crosscut, the quality of the groove, and then the panel glue together, I'll call it, the glue line. How good of a glue line can we get from just ripping the edges with the 40 tooth, gluing it together? And we're going to compare that to the 24 and the 60. Unfortunately, this went through a saw stop trip and it's a little wonky and it's got some tooth chip. I kept it more as a souvenir, so I can't really use this for anything. I'm a little bit sketched out to throw it in my saw, so we can't compare directly to a 50 tooth, but I've used plenty of these numerous times over the years. I'm never gonna buy another one. I don't think they really serve a great purpose, but you'll just have to take my word for it on the results with the 50 tooth. Now for the testing portion of this video, again, we're comparing rip blade to 40 tooth and then 60 tooth crosscut to the general purpose 40 tooth as well. This is the thickest thing I had in this shop, so we're gonna compare the rip on the 2x4 as well. Now this I have put a flat face on because it was just too twisted for me to safely put it through here. So this will have a flat face. And then we're going to rip a piece of pine in half in an attempt to re-glue it back together to see the panel glue line on the rip blade versus the 40 tooth. Then for cross cutting, we're going to do a straight cross cut and a miter. And then to finish it out, we're going to do some plywood as well as a non-through cut dado. So we can see the groove on the bottom and then the plywood as well. Now for the gluing, I'm going to be ripping a piece in half. But if you are using two separate pieces and you're not 100% confident that this is at 90 degrees, put one piece through, mark the faces off, run piece through with the face down, take the other piece, run it with face up, and therefore, whatever offset it is on the degrees, they'll cancel each other out. Any two cuts going across a flat face will equal 180 degrees. So you can cut incorrect angles per se, and then when you go to glue them back together, they will still be a nice, relatively flat piece of wood, though some of that comes down to your clamping setup. Now, one thing I want you to pay attention to with the rip on the 2x4 is the speed. It's going to be faster with the 24 tooth, though not too bad with the 40 tooth. Here are our two cuts. This is the rip cut with the rip blade and the 40 tooth. Now we can see some blade marks down there that may have been due to pressure of me, but one thing, you won't be able to really feel it obviously, but this is not as smooth. This is just much smoother feeling than the 40 tooth. We've got some blade marks up here in the top right. You can see them right there. And it's just kind of not tear out per se, but a little fuzzy. This would still glue together fine on a panel, but you can just kind of see blade marks there, but this is just shinier. It's just a smoother kind of surface. Overall, though, not a massive difference other than speed. We are now going to just rip straight down the middle of this with the 40, then we'll do the 24. I'll glue them up and then we can compare. It's been about 24 hours since I glued these up. And we're gonna now take a look at them. I ran them through the planer so that we could get a clear look at the glue line. I think they turned out pretty good. And honestly, if I didn't label them, I wouldn't know a huge difference. One of these was done with a 40 tooth blade, the general purpose, and the other with a 24 tooth rip blade. As you can see, there is little to no difference. Now the grain hides one of them better. This one is the 40 tooth and this one is the 24. Overall, I think an excellent job on both. These aren't breaking, you know, it's pine, so it's obviously not the strongest, but I can't break that apart no matter how hard I try. So overall for me, I consider that a good glue line, good glue joint, and it hides it pretty well. So I'd be thrilled with that if these were my panels that came out of just coming straight off the table saw blade. And like I said, not a huge difference. You really can't tell for sure that one was done with a general purpose blade and one was done with a rip blade. Up next, we have the crosscut, 60 tooth crosscut blade versus 40 tooth general purpose. Now, I just want to say that some of this is going to come down to your miter gauge and its ability to move through the miter slot smoothly. If this has play in it, you're going to get blade marks no matter what blade you use because it's going to be hitting the blade a little bit as it goes through. So it may simply be the play in your miter saw and not the blade that's causing you issues. So I've got the anchor gauge. It's pretty good. We're going to go through one on each end and then compare. Here is the 40 tooth. You can see we've got a few blade marks, but overall pretty good. A little bit of tear out back here. Normally I'd use some tear out prevention, but for this purpose, we want to know what the tear out looks like. Overall, pretty good. And then here we have the 60 tooth, and there are very few blade marks. We've only got a little bit up in the corner here, but this is just glassy smooth compared to the other one. And we've got just a minor bit of tear out right there, but a little wave away, and it is magically gone. So overall, again, crosscut blade better. 40 tooth, still pretty darn good. Up next, we're going to do the miter, bevel, whatever you want to call it. And this is a cut that can really expose a blade because for whatever reason, it seems to be kind of harder for it to get through there and it can leave blade marks. I only do 60 tooth on the boxes that I end up selling. I have plenty of personal mitered things in here that are done with 40 tooth. I don't know, just maybe superstition, but I wouldn't use a 40 tooth if I was selling it. Though I've never had a problem in my shop. I've never had something fall apart and I don't spline everything. But we're gonna look, normally I do some tear out prevention methods because this is where you can get tear out and breaking out of the end of this cut, but I'm not gonna do any here just so we can see the blade itself without any tear out prevention on the end. Here is the 40. You can see some pretty obvious blade marks on there, but it feels pretty smooth. And like I said, I've made a lot of mitered boxes for the shop out of the 42 general purpose blade, and they held together fine. Nowhere near as, you know, kind of glassy smooth as the 60. Little tear out, not terrible though, all things considered. A little bit right there, but overall, I'd be extremely pleased with that. And then ignore the dent up here. This has been sitting for a while on a shelf and getting moved around a bunch, but overall, you only see a few blade marks, if any. It's just a much cleaner cut. And I would highly suggest if you're doing a lot of these or if you plan to sell something, get a 60 tooth blade for this. You can get away with it with a 40, but I think this is definitely a place where a 60 tooth becomes a much better option. We're going to move on to cutting plywood. Now, plywood behaves differently when you're ripping it versus cross-cutting it. At least in my experience, I get more tear out on the bottom when I'm cross-cutting it. And one thing I will say is that thinner plywood is a little bit more problematic because it often twists and curves. Thinner, cheap plywood gets really problematic. Home store stuff, the thinnest veneers you'll ever see, especially now. They used to be thicker. There are two things you can do to mitigate that I think are reasonable. The first is a zero clearance or as close to zero clearance throat plate as possible. If you have like a job site saw, you can find really good fitting MDF ones online on Etsy and places like that. It's not a bad idea to have one of those for cutting plywood. Obviously, the more teeth, the better for plywood and melamine, things like that. They make blades specifically for those with an incredible amount of teeth, 70, 80, 90. We're doing 40 and we're gonna compare it to 60. Now, this is not great plywood. This is cheap plywood. And the other thing that can help is that the face side, you want to be the one where the fiber behind is supported. Tear out happens when that final fiber is not supported and the saw blade just rips right through it, yanking that final fiber out and you get tear out. So choose your face side. Ideally, you have a face side and you don't need to see both. And make sure the face side is facing up. That way, when the saw blade enters, that veneer has something behind it. Now, this doesn't always work. Some people put blue tape all over it. Some people pre-score it. I don't know. That's a lot of work, especially if you're making a lot of cuts. And it doesn't always work perfectly. So, you know, you spend money on tape over time. All I can suggest is that keep the face side up, and that's going to give you the most help you probably can. Just be warned that the back side may get some tear out. We'll see how bad this is. This isn't the worst plywood I've ever cut, but it's not great. This is the face side. You can see 40 rip, 60 crosscut, 40 crosscut. Everything looks pretty good on the top, and that's why I always keep the top up. Let's look at the bottom. 40, 60, 60, 40. Pretty good on the rip on the 40. Got a little bit of tear out down here, but honestly, that's absolutely fine. No tear out up here on the top. Now the crosscut is where we get a little interesting. Here's the 40. Here's where we start having problems. It's just pulling through those bottom fibers on the crosscut. Again, this is not the worst. And if this is how it came out and I was only using the face side, I'd be thrilled. Now we go to the 60 crosscut again. Now here you see essentially nothing except a little bit up here in this top corner. That's all we've got. So honestly, not the biggest difference in the world, but definitely better with the 60. Our final comparison is going to be doing a groove, just gonna fit this guy into here, typical groove. And any saw blade is going to allow you to make a groove. This is about the bottom of it. And the alternating tooth bevel on the 40 tooth is going to leave this kind of fang pattern on the bottom. There will be a gap. If you were doing some kind of shelving, you would want to cover that up with some kind of edge banding. It's just a little unsightly. We're going to compare it to the flat top grind on this 24 tooth. Now I will say Diablo's rip blades, for whatever reason, do not have the flat top grind. They are the alternating tooth bevel, so you can't get that just by buying their rip blade. I do not know why. Same company, they just refuse to put the flat top grind on their normal rip blade for the Diablo line. Here are the different grooves. Now, the visual difference is pretty obvious. 40 tooth on this side, flat top grind rip on this side. This is just flat and smooth all the way through. This has the, what I call little fangs. You can see them right there, ridges, whatever you want to call them. Now you can mitigate these a bit by taking a long time and just nudging over very slowly. However, if you have a router plane and you wish to clean these up, that's going to be your most efficient method if you don't want to just buy a flat top grind saw blade, or you don't want to just do these on the router table. If you want to clean this up somehow, a router plane is going to be your easiest method. Here is what it looks like with the 40 tooth. You can see it's resting on those little ridges, those high points, so it's going to leave that gap. There's nothing you can do about it other than either clean it out with a router plane or edge band it to cover it up. There's just nothing you can do. It's always going to have at least a little bit of ridge. However, when we move over to the flat top grind blade, it's gone. It's a perfect fit. Now, it still may be unsightly for you to see this joint, and you may want to edge band, but it's going to make contact at the bottom. And the other reason that this is somewhat important is that you get more glue surface, right? On the 40, you really only have contact on the two sides. You get just a little bit on the ridges on the bottom. On the flat top grind blade, you do get that bottom surface as well to get the edge to face grain. I don't know, if it's like a shelf or something, it's probably not the biggest deal, but visually it's certainly a stark difference. And this is just what you have to live with the 40 tooth blade. If it's kind of a shallow enough one, you can often chisel those out. So there definitely are ways to deal with it. That's just the reality of any alternating tooth bevel. After walking through the rip cut, cross cut, miter cut, dado, and plywood, hopefully you've seen why I believe the 40 tooth general purpose from Diablo is the ideal blade if you can only afford one blade. It absolutely is a compromise. If you can only have one blade, you are making a compromise. And we compared each of those cuts to the more ideal blade, the rip blade or the specific crosscut blade. And we could see the difference. In some, there was not a huge difference. In others, there was a fair bit of difference. However, at the end of the day, I still think the 40 tooth is superior to the 50 tooth. It's also a little cheaper, and I really like the Diablo because you can find it almost anywhere in stores if you don't want to order online. It's relatively cheap, $28 to $35. They last a while, and I just think overall it's a great blade. If you have a different opinion and you believe there's another blade, even just another brand that somebody should consider if they can only afford one blade, leave it below in the comments. All right, thanks for joining me.